Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
Ms Richards.
Professor Keel, I want to ask you next about the Scottish Executive Inquiry that was undertaken between 1999 and 2000. I want to start in the middle of 1999, so before the decision had been taken to have the inquiry, at SCGV 0000176_118. This is from Mr. Bell in the Healthcare Policy Division, 15th of July 1999, and we can see that it's addressed to the Minister and copied to, amongst others, you. And the purpose of the briefing is to brief the Minister on the Haemophilia Society's continuing campaign for compensation for haemophiliacs infected with hepatitis C as a result of NHS treatment using blood or blood products. And if we go over the page, having referred to the Haemophilia Society's campaign, paragraph 4 explains that the previous administration rejected claims for such a no-fault payment scheme on the grounds that, and then before we look at any of those bullet points, we're here looking at middle of July 1999, so would it be right to understand that we're now in a devolved government exercising healthcare powers?
Yes.
And then we can see the first bullet point is the patients concerned received the best treatment available at the time. That's the line which we discussed yesterday, which was essential for their survival. And in the absence of negligence on the part of the NHS, there was no basis for making payments. Now, I wanted to ask you about the addition that we see in this document of those words, which was essential for their survival. That might lead the reader to believe that they were being told that the treatment was invariably life-saving and that every haemophiliac would have died without it. Would you agree?
Well, all severe haemophiliacs are increased risk of death without coagulation factor treatment. So I think that's what this bullet point is referring to. It doesn't mean that all of them are going to die from their condition, but as I said yesterday, life-threatening bleeds in severe haemophiliacs are by no means rare, and particularly intracranial hemorrhage clearly is a severe threat to survival. But I don't think this implies that all of them were at substantial risk of death all the time. But in the event of a bleed, particularly an intracranial bleed, then they definitely would be, and they would need treatment to allow them to come through that bleed.
This is addressed to a minister who is unlikely themselves, for the most part, to have medical qualifications or medical knowledge of their own. Might it not be said that this was putting it too strong and an overstatement, both in terms of an overgeneralisation, but also an overstatement of the necessity for concentrates?
I don't believe it's an overstatement. I mean, it is a generalisation, I agree with you, but I don't believe it's an overstatement.
If we go to, excuse me, the next page, we can see paragraph 7 explains this issue has been treated as a UK-wide matter on which the 4 territorial health departments should adopt a consistent line. Mr Dobson's announcement was therefore endorsed by Mr Galbraith as Scottish Office Minister for Health, and that's what we looked at yesterday. The issue now comes within the remit of the Scottish Parliament, and it appears from the attached correspondence and a recent inquiry from James Douglas Hamilton that the Haemophilia Society is now focusing its efforts on the Parliament. And then the recommendation in paragraph 9, in light of the fact that the Department of Health have rigorously examined this issue twice in recent years and that the Haemophilia Society have not produced fresh evidence to support their claim for financial assistance, we advise that a further examination of this issue would only draw the same conclusions previously reached. We therefore recommend that the Minister endorses the decision taken by her predecessor and signs the attached reply. If we just go back to the first page, there's some handwriting which says, I would agree but need SD decision. Do you know whose handwriting that is?
No, I don't, but SD is clearly Susan Deacon.
The Minister to whom this was addressed.
Yes.
You're the only, I think, medical officer. Oh no, there's Dr. Woods. Who was Dr. Woods?
Dr. Woods is not a medical doctor. He was chief exec of the department at that point.
So would it be fair to assume that in terms of any medical advice within this document, either you're the source of it or effectively you've agreed with it?
Yes.
Now, that's July 1999. What's your recollection of how it came about that the Minister decided to commission an internal investigation?
Well, it's a long time ago, but my recollection is that, as the submission indicates, post-devolution there was intense lobbying of MSPs through the parliamentary process, particularly by the Haemophilia Society, and that the new minister obviously was in receipt of all that lobbying, and that I suspect, although, I mean, you are interviewing her I
Yes.
believe, later this week, she's better placed to answer than I, but my impression was that post-devolution increased lobbying, and she was certainly persuaded that we needed to drill down further into the allegations of the Haemophilia Society that Scottish blood products, principally factor 8, were less safe than those coming from England at the time. She was very keen to get to the bottom of that.
And the ambit of the investigation essentially became the question over Scotland lagging behind England in terms of producing hepatitis-safe, heat-treated concentrate in a period between 1985 and 1987. Is that broadly correct?
Indeed.
And is it right to understand that ambit is a reflection of the particular focus of the Haemophilia Society's lobbying? Is that right?
That's correct.
And the investigation was not widened to look, for example, at the position of those who'd been infected through blood transfusion?
No, the Haemophilia Society were very focused on haemophilia community, understandably, and the remit of the internal inquiry was framed absolutely around what they wanted to be looked at and was agreed by them.
And was there any lobby group or other group representing the interests or position of those who'd been infected through transfusion at that point in time in Scotland?
I can't recall.
If we pick matters up in August 1999, just to establish some of the chronology, it's SBTS 0000379_040, please, Lawrence. So this is a meeting held on the 30th of August 1999 to discuss the investigation. We can see that from the Scottish Executive there are 4 in attendance: you, Mrs Towers, Mrs Faulkner, Mr Palmer. There's also someone attending from the Central Legal Office, and then 3 from BTS. And then if we look at the first paragraph, we can see it refers to the Minister being due to meet the Haemophilia Society on the 14th of September to hear their concerns about the infection of haemophiliacs with HCV through treatment with SNBTS products. Explain that the Minister had requested a report analysing what had happened at that time with an assessment of whether SNBTS's position could be said to have been negligent, and that after the investigation the Minister would brief the Parliament's Health Committee on its findings. Now, bearing in mind that the focus of the investigation is to determine whether SNBTS had been negligent, is there any particular reason why the investigation process seems to have commenced with a meeting with representatives of SNBTS before even the Minister has met with the Haemophilia Society?
Well, the meeting was clearly to prepare for that ministerial meeting and make sure that the Minister was briefed as accurately as possible in advance of the 14th of September. So I don't find it surprising in any way that we would want to meet with SNBTS to discuss the lines of the inquiry and get preliminary feedback from them on the issues that might arise.
It was presumably never going to be very likely that SNBTS would put their hands up and say, yes, we were negligent, or yes, we were at fault. To what extent in the course of the investigation was the submissions made by, material provided by SNBTS subjected to any kind of rigorous scrutiny?
My recollection is that what was sought from SNBTS was a factual, chronological account of the measures it had taken in the mid-1980s to ensure that hepatitis C factor VIII was available.
If we turn then, so that was the 30th of August, if we turn to a meeting on the 1st of September, that's PRSE 40978. So this is the second meeting that we see being held, and this is with Professor Ludlam and Professor Lowe, and again, you're in attendance, Mrs Faulkner and Mr Palmer are also from the Scottish Executive. The purpose of the meeting in the first paragraph is explained by you as being to clarify the validated information that would be needed from each of the haemophilia centres for the planned ministerial briefing on the 9th of September. Now, bearing in mind this was looking at, or this was an investigation which was to look at SNBTS's actions, why had it seemed particularly important to speak to Professor Ludlam and Professor Lowe at the outset of the investigation?
Well, they, each of them headed up the two biggest haemophilia centres in Scotland, so therefore they were the two main prescribers of factor VIII. So clearly their recollection of events in the mid-1980s was material to the internal investigation.
Can you assist us in understanding why the focus of the investigation was negligence, which would ordinarily be a matter determined by the courts, rather than perhaps a broader question of whether there was fault or things that could or should have been done differently or better?
And as I said earlier, the remit was that requested by the Haemophilia Society. So I imagine that word, the use of that word, emanated from them.
If we go towards the bottom of the page, please, paragraph 4, this records a further contribution from you. Dr. Keel pointed out that it would be necessary to fully investigate the circumstances and events during that time and to cost, based on a range of scenarios, the different types of assistance which might be awarded. Now, just pausing there, does that reflect the fact that one of the underlying purposes of the investigation was to inform a decision about whether or not to provide financial support?
Not directly. The purpose of the investigation was to understand, as I said earlier, the facts and the chronology of events during the period in question. But it would have been remiss of any government department not to be anticipating that the Haemophilia Society, which was already lobbying hard for financial redress, would increase those efforts during and after the production of the report.
And then continuing with paragraph 4, it was therefore essential to estimate how many people would be eligible. Any follow-up action taken by the department would be in consultation with the other territorial departments on a UK-wide basis. And then this, she advised that the chronologies of events provided by BPL and SNBTS were revealing. PFC and BPL had deliberately chosen to pursue different paths in the development of heat treatment methods in order to cover more than one option and increase the likelihood of at least one plant coming up with a breakthrough. PFC did so for HIV and BPL then did so in retrospect unwittingly for HCV. Was it your understanding, therefore, that the different heat treatment strategies adopted by BPL and PFC were in some way coordinated so as to be complementary?
I think there was a degree of complementarity. Whether it was serendipitous, well, there definitely was a degree of complementarity. Whether that was deliberate or serendipitous evades me at this time. It's so long ago.
We can see, if we then pick it up at paragraph 6, this, Professor Lowe and Professor Ludlam confirmed that it was normal practice within their centres to inform patients of the result of a test if they were found to be HCV positive. Dr. Keel would confirm that this was the procedure within the other haemophilia centres. In particular, she was concerned about the case of a Dundee patient highlighted in the press coverage who had claimed not to have been informed of his infection for a year after he was tested. Now, why was it that this issue about informing patients or the failure to inform patients of test results, why was this issue being ventilated in the meeting given that the ambit of the investigation was focusing upon the 85-87 period and SNBTS?
The remit of the investigation also covered, at the Haemophilia Society's request, the information provided to patients. So that's why this discussion was material.
And was what Professor Lowe and Professor Ludlam there said, and the use of the word is confirmed, was that simply accepted as face value? That's what they've told us, so that must be correct.
Well, I'm struggling to know what other investigation we could have undertaken to confirm that what they said was correct. So yes, it was taken at face value. But I also knew from my own clinical practice in Glasgow, which we touched on yesterday, doing clinics with Professor Lowe and others, that was the practice in Glasgow. I had no reason to believe that it was different in Edinburgh.
In relation to Glasgow, you were there between 1983 and 1986, and of course, hepatitis C was not known at that point in time, and there was no test available. So you couldn't, I think, have been familiar with Professor Lowe's practices in relation to hepatitis C, could you?
Only insofar as liver enzymes were taken at every visit and discussed at the following visit. So the non-A, non-B context was discussed in those clinics.
You, I think, said in response to my question about whether this information was essentially taken at face value, and I'm paraphrasing your answer, Professor Keel, what else could be done? The executive could have asked the Haemophilia Society to provide details of patients who claimed otherwise, could it not? Could have asked to see patient records?
the Haemophilia Society and many patients' views were taken into account. Patients wrote in to the department in the process of the inquiry and aired their views. So that they were given that opportunity. I'm not sure that going through patients' notes, well, it would have been a very lengthy and laborious process, particularly going back so far, over 15 years by this point, to try to, I don't think looking at the notes would have been a very fruitful exercise in trying to determine what the practice was around informing patients of their results.
It might be said, Professor, that if you have an investigation, one aspect of which is to look at what patients were told, that if all you're going to do is accept a doctor's assurance that they did tell patients, that's not much of an investigation. If that submission were to be made, what would be your comment?
It wasn't. That element of the investigation wasn't limited to what clinicians have told patients. It was also related to information provided in the form of leaflets, etc. And I think we laid hands on a number of those publications in the course of the inquiry. So it was more of a holistic approach to information provided rather than just practices around informing patients of results.
If we pick matters up next in September, a little later, about a week or so later, at SCGV 5043_047. So this is a briefing provided by Mr. Palmer, who we saw in attendance at those two meetings, to the Minister, 8th of September 1999, copied to you amongst obviously a number of others. And the purpose is described in paragraph 1 as to provide initial briefing to the Minister prior to her meeting with the Haemophilia Society on the 14th of September. If we go over the page, we can see paragraph 5 sets out what the government's position has been. Essentially, if there's no fault, there should be no compensation, and the assertions made there again that patients received the best treatment available given the state of knowledge at the time. And then paragraph 6 says this.
That's a slightly different formulation from the previous one. Previously, there was no reference to the state of knowledge at the time, but the words were which was essential for their survival.
Yes, this picks up more the wording of the briefing that we looked at yesterday afternoon.
Which was, as is set out here.
Yes. And then paragraph 6 says, agreeing no fault compensation for haemophiliacs with HCV would have major policy implications in that it would promote the elastic concept of a moral liability on government to compensate individuals who've been damaged, however inadvertently, by its actions. Now, this is Mr. Palmer's briefing, Professor, not yours, but do you recall what your thoughts were at the time about the concept of a moral liability or moral responsibility?
Well, at the time, my view was that there had been no fault attributed to SNBTS or the NHS, and that was the justification that had been for many, many years of the government's position, with the exception of the precedent we discussed yesterday for HIV. So my view was that, Mike Palmer's language is slightly difficult to interpret, but I suppose what he's trying to say is that where patients have been damaged but no negligence has been proved on the part of the NHS, then for the government to embark on an open-ended, no-fault compensation scheme would be a very major change in policy with major implications further down the route for the amount of money to be spent, and therefore, by definition, the amount of money then available for direct patient care. I think that's probably what he's trying to get at. But of course, it's his words, as you said, not mine.
And then under the heading Recent Developments, paragraph 7 sets out the background in terms of the Society's campaigning, and then says their key concerns seem to be that, and then there are a number of 3 sub-paragraphs. A is concerned with the issue that we've already touched on, the difference between Scotland and England in terms of an HCV-safe product. And then B and C, B is assurances were given at the time that the SNBTS product was safe from infection, when in fact it was known that it was not safe from hepatitis C. And then C is some patients who were tested HCV positive in the early 90s were not told that they were infected until long after the test results were known, during which time they ran a higher risk of infecting close family members because of their ignorance. So I just draw attention to that so that we can make sense of what we see a couple of pages further on. So that's paragraph 7, B and C of the briefing. If we go to the next page, the bottom of the page has the heading Current Investigations, and paragraph 14 refers to the department being engaged in an investigation of events and circumstances surrounding the introduction of heat-treated factor VIII blood products in the mid-80s. And then paragraph 15 refers to paragraph 7A, that's the issue about the heat-treated product, and says we prepared an initial overview of the events in the mid-80s arising from our inquiries so far. If we go over the page, paragraphs 16 and 17 deal with the charge at paragraph 7B, so that's the question of the extent to which information about infectivity of the product was provided to patients. Paragraph 18 refers to the charge at paragraph 7C, and it's said to be a claim currently investigating, and that's the issue of people not being told of their positive test results. And then if we go to the heading Draft Agenda for the meeting on 14 September, a reference is made to an attached draft agenda at Annex C. And then paragraph 20 says this: with regard to section 3 of the agenda, we will wish to probe the basis for the statements made at the 2nd and 3rd indents of that section. Now, to understand that, I want to look at the draft agenda with you. So if we could go, please, to page 11. This is the draft agenda, and if we look at paragraph 3, which is the paragraph being referred to in Mr. Palmer's briefing, why were Scottish people with haemophilia exposed to the risk of HCV for longer than those treated with English product? The 2nd and 3rd indents are little or no information provided to patients at the time about HCV risks, although evidence of non-A, non-B hepatitis transmitted through blood products was being accumulated through the 70s and early 80s. And by 1985, risks of HCV were very well documented and research well advanced into heat treatment. So those are the 2nd and 3rd indents. If we go back to page 4, please, in paragraph 20 of the briefing. Again, I'm conscious this is not a document authored by you, Professor Keel, but the suggestion there wanting to probe the basis for the Haemophilia Society's statement in relation to the 2nd indent, which is about little or no information being provided to patients about HCV, it might be said that the Scottish Executive Health Department was taking an approach towards the Haemophilia Society's assertions, wanting to probe the basis for them, that it wasn't taking towards the Haemophilia Centre directors, accepting at face value what they told the health department. Do you have any comment on that?
I think what we were looking for from the Haemophilia Society was as much intelligence to inform the inquiry that ultimately took place as possible. I think it was a genuine desire to know what lay behind their allegations, rather than subjecting them to a grilling that we weren't subjecting the haemophilia directors to.
And then Annex B of the briefing, which Mr Palmer had described as an overview, an initial overview arising from our inquiries so far, that starts on page 7. And if we go over the page to page 8, we've got the heading Protection from Hepatitis towards the top of the page. And then paragraph 8 says this: our consultations suggest that from the late 1970s, when non-A, non-B hepatitis first surfaced, to the mid-1980s, there was very little evidence that non-A, non-B hepatitis produced adverse symptoms, and that it was generally regarded as mild and non-progressive. For example, as late as February 87, Dr Forrester, medical advisor at the Scottish office, reported that non-A, non-B hepatitis would appear to be relatively benign, despite some risk of cirrhosis of the liver in the long term, unless the recipient is pregnant, when the effects can be very serious. Now, again, I appreciate that this is some time ago, but are you able to assist in understanding what's referred to as our consultations there? In other words, what was the evidence-gathering exercise that led to the conclusions that are being recorded in paragraph 8? Do you know?
No, I don't, but I infer from the mention of Dr Forrester that at least part of that consultation was looking through the files to see, to gather references to non-A, non-B hepatitis, which had been collected by government. But I don't know what else it means in terms of consulting.
Was there any form of review of the medical literature from the 70s and 80s undertaken?
That was part of the internal report, yes.
And who would have undertaken that review of the medical literature? Was that you, or was that somebody else?
Well, Christine Dora was the administrator in the lead in drafting the report, so it was principally down to her. But I can't remember, but probably have drawn her attention to key articles that had appeared in the medical press round about this time.
And do you know whether any consideration was given, whether by Ms Dora or you or by other colleagues within the health department, to making any contact with the civil servants in the Scottish office who'd been dealing with this issue in the course of the 1980s?
I have no recollection of that happening.
If we go just then to page 10, paragraph 18 is headed Initial Conclusions, and says our initial impressions from this outline of events, which has been gathered from our preliminary investigations, are that SMBTS did all they could at the time to develop a factor VIII product which was safe from HCV, given the state of knowledge at the time and the key objective of combating HIV. And then secondly, there's no evidence that SMBTS lagged without good reason behind England. Now those are described as initial impressions and initial conclusions and preliminary investigations, but they're expressed in fairly strong and decided terms at a point in time at which the Haemophilia Society meeting hasn't even taken place yet. It may be submitted to the inquiry in due course that this was an investigation undertaken essentially with a closed mind or predetermined position. Do you have any observations in relation to that submission if it were made?
I disagree. I think it's absolutely consistent with providing ministers with all the facts that were known at the time, and indeed the preliminary conclusions that were being drawn from those facts in preparation for a meeting with the Haemophilia Society.
If we turn to SCGV 40170_164, this is a further briefing from Mr Palmer, 10th of September 1999, to the Minister. Purpose is said to outline a way forward which the Minister can offer the Haemophilia Society at a meeting with them on the 14th of September. And then if we just go down the page, the recommendation is, in line with our discussions with the Minister yesterday, we recommend that she closes the meeting on the 14th of September by outlining the following way forward. A, the Department have commenced investigations into Scotland's efforts to make blood products HCV safe in the mid-1980s, and the concerns articulated by the Society today will be followed up in carrying those investigations forward. I want to emphasise that the Department is at arm's length from SNBTS and is engaged in an impartial and objective analysis of the events and circumstances surrounding this issue. Do you consider it's right to say that the Department is at arm's length from SNBTS? Obviously, they are different bodies, but we've seen that there was a close, perfectly understandably, close working relationship between the Department and SNBTS. And there had been regular meetings over the years with SNBTS representatives, again for perfectly proper reasons. Was the Department really in a position to engage in an impartial and objective analysis of SNBTS's actions?
I believe that it was. We had no direct involvement in directing SNBTS's operations. So I think that the department was in a perfectly reasonable position to conduct this investigation of events that happened many years before, based on evidence gathering from SNBTS, but also from haemophilia directors, as well as the Haemophilia Society.
And if we turn to the next page, we can see in paragraph B the link being made with the possibility of compensation. And then paragraph C says this: the department aims to report on its investigations within a month. Now, as it happened, it took over a year. It's late October 2000, I think, when the report was published. What's your understanding of why it took that length of time?
Well, my recollection of this is hazy, but at least part of it, I think, relates to the fact that I was trying to, from the UKHCDO registry, get accurate figures on how many Scottish patients had been treated with what might be described as at-risk products during the period in question. And that proved a very difficult task. And I can't remember now whether we ever finally got that data that we were seeking. That at least was part of the reason that the report took a year rather than a month.
And I haven't gone to it, but I'll give a reference for the transcript. It's right to note that you wrote to Dr. Colvin, Chair of UKHCDO. I don't think the date of the letter is clear, but it's LOTH 5011_007. And then we will, I think, see some further documents in early 2000 which report that you've not had a response or that you're chasing for a response. Can we then just go to SCGV 40170_232? Can we just go to the bottom of the page, please? I'm sorry, can we take that down? There's something which hasn't been redacted, which I think possibly ought to have been redacted. I'll come back to that document at a later stage if we need to. That is the note of the meeting. Yes, we do have another version of that document, but not at present. My apologies, Professor Keel. In any event, there was a meeting on the 14th of September with representatives of the Haemophilia Society. The document that we looked at a few minutes ago that was appended to Mr. Palmer's briefing, that Annex B, which set out the initial investigations and initial impressions, do you know whether that document was provided to the Haemophilia Society in the course of the investigation so that they could see the department's thinking and comment on and respond to it?
I don't remember, but I think it's highly unlikely it would have been provided to them. It was internal briefing for ministers, so I think we can conclude it wouldn't have been shared.
The reason I ask that, Professor, in particular, is the document that I had asked to be taken down. I'm just going to read a sentence from it. It's paragraph 10 of that note of the meeting on the 14th of September, and it records the Minister pointing out that she wished the examination to be carried out in an open and transparent manner. And it might be said again that conducting the investigation in an open and transparent manner might include providing your initial findings, like when I say the department's initial findings or impressions to the society for it to be able to respond on an informed basis.
Well, again, I beg to differ. I think that when it came to the report, final report being produced, it was issued in draft form to the main stakeholders, if you like, including the Haemophilia Society, so that they could comment on the more refined conclusions that we'd arrived at that point. I don't think that not sharing the ministerial briefing with the Haemophilia Society means that the inquiry wasn't conducted in an open and transparent way.
Yes, I should say, for the sake of clarity, I wasn't suggesting that the briefing itself was something that ought to be shared with the Haemophilia Society. It was the annex to the briefing, Annex B, which set out what it was the department had obtained by way of information and evidence so far.
Well, I don't know whether it was shared, but as I said earlier, I think it's highly unlikely.
Can we then just pick up on a point of detail in your witness statement, please? WITN 5736003. And if we go to page 47, in paragraph D, if we just, thank you. I just want to pick up on a point that's made in the second half of the paragraph. So you're talking here about the different approaches taken by BPL and PFC to viral inactivation. And halfway down the paragraph, you say this: in the event the PFC was ahead of BPL with an HIV-safe product, And then BPL was ahead of the PFC in developing an HCV-safe product in 1985. And then it's this phrase, although this was not proven until 1988. Now, the inquiry has seen documents from 1985 and 1986, which suggest that there was a basis for optimism about the BPL product. The initial results and findings were good. That's not something which is referred to here. You use the phrase, although not proven until 1988. Can you help us in understanding why and whether you were aware that there was evidence that the BPL product didn't transmit hepatitis C that was available in 85, 86?
Well, I think having a basis for optimism is not the same as proof that the product was HCV safe. And that only emerged in 1988. So that's what I was trying to reflect. There were preliminary, of course, findings along the way, but the nature of hepatitis C is that you have to, in the absence of a test, which was not in existence at that point, you have to let some time elapse to determine whether patients had indeed been infected with non-A, non-B hepatitis.
Do you recall whether you were aware of the preliminary evidence that was available before 1988, which indicated or pointed to the likelihood of this being safe in terms of transmission of non-A, non-B hepatitis?
I don't recall whether I was aware or not. But to me, the material point is that it wasn't definitively proved until 3 years later.
May I just ask a question here? By 1988, there wasn't as yet a test for the actual virus itself because one hadn't yet been developed. That didn't take place till 1989. So what one's looking for here is a product being administered to recipients and seeing whether any of them then showed the signs which clinically indicated that they had non-A, non-B. And those signs would be what were repeated liver function tests, more than one occasion, which showed elevation, and the absence of any positive tests for hepatitis B and hepatitis A. It was really a diagnosis of exclusion, wasn't it?
Indeed.
So
yeah.
The proof of the pudding is the absence of any infection demonstrated by those tests. You just need one person or two people to say, well, I had this product, I have this result. The result is positive, I've got non-A, non-B, and you'd be able to say, well, the product doesn't work. The proof of the negative is what you have to show that the English BPL product actually worked. It's not going to come quickly, but by 1988, you regarded it as proven. In other words, there'd been sufficient product out there without any report of any infection. The steps along the way to that are seeing whether anyone checks at intervals and sees if there's any infection. And progressively, my impression would be, with those tests, nobody produces a positive result. That goes on, and the groundswell develops to an extent where you can say that, yes, this is absolutely proven. Is that a fair summary of the process?
That's absolutely what I was trying to convey, but much more fluently. Thank you.
Thank you.
The penultimate sentence in that paragraph makes the point that the BPL project was not produced in sufficient quantities to make England self-sufficient. Was it your understanding that the cohort of patients who might be particularly at risk in this period that you were looking at, that the department was looking at, 85 to 87, would be likely to be patients who had been either previously untreated or minimally treated? They were those who were most likely to be at risk from treatment with a product that transmitted hepatitis C. Is that correct?
Yes, because we know with hindsight that prior to an HCV safe product being produced, that 100% of haemophilia patients would have contracted non-A, non-B hepatitis. So the clinical trials, and of course this long predates any involvement, or any of my involvement through the government, the clinical trials that would have been conducted in the mid-1980s would have, I think, exclusively been in previously untreated patients, so that the effects could be determined in them who had never been exposed to any other products.
Now, you observe, as I understand it correctly, that at this point in time, BPL wasn't producing sufficient quantities of product for everybody in England or England and Wales to be treated. But did the department's investigation look at what might be thought to be the separate but important question of whether BPL might have sufficient quantities of 8Y in order to be able to spare some for that smaller cohort of patients in Scotland who were previously untreated or had been minimally treated? In other words, the very cohort most at risk. Was that something the investigation looked at?
I think there is mention in the investigation report, or I've seen it in some document, that a small amount of 8Y, the BPL product, was indeed obtained, I think by Edinburgh, but that was obviously on the basis of clinician to clinician approach. I mean, I was working in London during this period in the mid-80s, and I recall that at the Middlesex, where I worked for a bit, that 8Y was often in short supply, even in that major centre. So BPL were not hanging on to loads of that product that could have been accessed by Scotland. So I think it highly unlikely that other than the small amount that came in, as I said, I think to Edinburgh, there would have been excess product available for north of the border.
But it's an issue that this inquiry has been investigating, Professor Keel, as to whether requests could and should have been made earlier to BPL for a small supply, but sufficient to enable the smaller number of Scottish patients most at risk to be treated. And if you don't recall, please say so, and we can obviously look, and we'll look with Mrs. Deacon in due course at the final inquiry report. But do you recall that coming up as an issue in the course of the investigation, whether requests could and should have been made to BPL for a supply earlier than they were?
I don't remember that being a subject that was discussed, but I, as I said a minute ago, I think there is reference within the document to the small amount that found its way north. I imagine that it was understood at the time that BPL were not able to produce enough product to cover England, and therefore the prospect of them, even if they had been formally approached, of releasing any for Scotland were low.
If we go to SCGV 40170_152, this is still in September 1999. If we look at the top of the page, it's an email sent on behalf of the First Minister, 23rd of September, and again, it's copied to you amongst others. And it says this: the First Minister has seen your minute of 17 September to the Minister for Health, outlining a way forward following the meeting with the Haemophilia Society. He was a little concerned about the possible financial implications and fears that an open mind could be taken to mean an open chequebook. He would be grateful for information on the likely exposure if compensation were to be awarded. Now, before we look at anything else on this document, do you have any recollection of your thoughts when you saw this email and the fear about an open mind?
I don't recall what I thought when I saw the email, but I mean, clearly, any administration would want to be able to quantify the amount associated with the compensation if that were to be awarded. And as we've seen from earlier documents, in preparation for this kind of response from ministers, the department had already begun to try to scope the numbers so that from who might be eligible, from those numbers, we could build scenarios around the possible financial implications of such a scheme if it were adopted.
Could we look at the bottom part of the page, please? There's a note on the right-hand side, which I think says this: Ms. Deacon's office advises that this is very much a PR exercise and that there is unlikely to be any compensation paid. Now, this is 9 days after the meeting with the Haemophilia Society, where the Minister has said to the Haemophilia Society, we're going to be open and transparent. Obviously, this is a matter that Ms. Deacon will no doubt be asked about in the course of the week. But do you maintain the answer you gave earlier that from your perspective this was an independent and impartial investigation in light of what's said to be here, the advice from the Minister that it was very much a PR exercise?
Well, as I said in my written statement, I certainly don't agree with the use of the term PR exercise. Undoubtedly, ministers were under great pressure to further investigate this area, and the Haemophilia Society undoubtedly had in mind compensation at the end of that period. However, I don't think that means that the investigation, the internal investigation, was not conducted in an entirely proper way. As I said earlier, finding out the facts, detailing the chronology so that we could really understand what the Haemophilia Society, whether what the Haemophilia Society were alleging was true or not. So the use of this term does not tally with my recollection of that period around the investigation.
Moving on then through the course of the investigation to November 99, WITN 2287019, please. WITN 22870119. You don't have it? Ah, okay. I'll pick that up after the break. In that case, my apologies, Professor, for the document issues this morning. We'll come back to that, so I'll take the investigation slightly out of chronological order. If we then move to SCGV 0000170_078, this is a meeting 14th of January 2000, and I draw attention to this just to see what's set out in paragraph 2, and this, I think, confirms the point that you made earlier, Professor Keel. It refers in paragraph 2 to the lack of information received so far from the haemophilia directors, and then it sets out that you had written in September, written again in mid-December, and sent another reminder in early January, and that the information received didn't answer all the questions. So I think that reflects what you already told us and put some dates on it. Can we then pick up ARCH 0003312_031. Now, this is a letter from you dated the 17th of January 2000, and we can see it's to Scottish haemophilia directors. Paragraph 1 refers to the meeting that we just briefly looked at. Paragraph 2 of the letter says this: you may recall that the Haemophilia Society are also particularly interested in pursuing the issue of what patients were told at the time of hepatitis C testing, including the clinical implications of a positive diagnosis. In addition, the Society alleged that Scottish patients were often completely unaware of possible adverse effects resulting from plasma-derived blood products and of other potential treatment options. So that's one of the issues that have been flagged up by the Society, and then we can see that in the third paragraph you want to discuss these important issues in more depth, and so you're inviting the Haemophilia Centre directors to a meeting. We can then see the meeting itself at ARCH 0003312_020. So, meeting on the 10th of February 2000, we can see again the attendees from the Scottish Executive, and then we have, on this occasion, we have Professor Ludlam and Professor Lowe again, but we also have directors from Dundee, Aberdeen, Inverness and York Hill. If we go towards the bottom of the page, we can see, and I'm not going to go through the detail of it, but we can see reference there to figures of HCV-positive patients said to be currently alive. And then if we go over the page, there's further information about the figures. If we can then pick it up at the bottom of the page, please, paragraph number 3. Dr. Keel reported that a major concern of the Haemophilia Society was that members alleged they were not given a clear explanation of the risks of treatment or the therapeutic options. Patients were tested without their knowledge and were not told of the results for some time, and that during that time their partners were exposed to the unnecessary risk of infection. So you're there recording the Haemophilia Society's complaint from members as to what they were not being told and what was happening without their knowledge. And then Mrs. Towers is then recorded as contributing. Now, Mrs. Towers was who?
She was a legal advisor to government.
And what she then says is explained it was therefore necessary to try to establish whether there was a general policy on what patients were told, and whether there, and I think the word was is missing, was an assessment of risk and if patients were given a choice. Now, it might be said that Mrs. Towers is there identifying a narrower issue. So rather than looking at what, as a matter of fact, did or didn't happen, looking to see whether there was a general policy about the provision of information to patients. What, if any, comment would you make in relation to that?
not sure I have any comment. I mean, she was clearly probing one aspect of this area of the inquiry.
We can then see a response from Professor Ludlam describing non-A, non-B hepatitis as a mild, non-progressive condition, in terms of the perceptions until the late 1980s. The first serious study on liver biopsy having been undertaken in 1985. And then this, Dr. Keel confirmed that this was also her understanding, and Dr. Watson advised the only test for the virus at the time would have been by surrogate markers. Was your understanding of this important issue about what was known regarding non-A, non-B hepatitis essentially based upon what Dr. Ludlam was saying to you, or was it based upon your own knowledge and review of the medical literature? Do you know?
The latter.
And then if we go down to paragraph 7, we can see it said, Professor Lowe pointed out that there was an awareness of hepatitis at the time and every patient was treated with great care because of the risks of transmission. He explained that the policy was that patients would be informed they were being tested and the results would be discussed at their next appointment, and then he refers to a publication in 85 and British Liver Trust leaflets. Was this information provided by Professor Lowe at this meeting, again, essentially accepted at face value by the investigation, as far as you can recall?
Yes, I think it was.
And then if we go over the page, paragraph 9 says this: Professor Lowe pointed out that most patients would have been infected whilst their predecessors were in post, and asked whether it was necessary to contact them to make them aware of the situation. Mrs. Towers explained that this was a factual information gathering exercise, but that it should be borne in mind that the information might be used in future court actions. Professor Ludlam also sought advice on whether HDs, so haemophilia directors, should be looking back to try to identify what had happened to patients whose whereabouts and status were unknown. Mrs. Towers confirmed that Central Legal Office was representing the trusts and SNBTS, and that the HDs should therefore follow CLO advice on whether any further investigation or the tracking down of patients was necessary. Now, obviously, this paragraph doesn't record any contribution or expression of view from you, Professor Keel. But as a medical practitioner, as well, obviously, as medical advisor to the government, do you have any concerns about the discussion that's recorded here? We have Professor Lowe asking about whether contact should be made with patients who might have been infected. And Mrs. Towers saying, well, that information might be used in future court actions and you should take legal advice.
I don't recollect this part of the discussion. I mean, legal advice is clearly very important. SNBTS were already in touch with CLO, so I think it's probably reasonable that Linda Towers advised them to speak to CLO before doing anything further.
I'm sorry.
I'm not quite, if I may, but I'm not quite sure what Professor Lowe had in mind in terms of tracking the patients down. I don't know what was in his mind. I mean, was he going to ask them about what information they'd been given? They would presumably be under the care of another haemophilia director or centre somewhere else who was looking after them from a non-A, non-B infection point of view and monitoring them. So, and in due course, the report was going to be produced, and indeed, as subsequently happened, there was publicity around it, awareness raising. So I'm really a bit mystified as to what was in Gordon Lowe's mind.
Yes, I mean, whatever Professor Lowe had in mind, it's I think, tolerably clear what Professor Ludlam had in mind, which was the question of whether haemophilia directors should be looking back to try and identify what has happened to patients whose whereabouts and status were unknown. The inquiry has had evidence, Professor Keel, in particular in relation to mild haemophiliacs who may not be in contact with haemophilia centres from 1 year to the next. And so there may be cohorts of patients not attending regularly at their haemophilia centre who might have been infected and were unaware of their infection. As a medical professional, whatever this particular paragraph does or doesn't mean, as a medical professional, would it have been, in your view, important that, bearing in mind we're now in 2000 and there's a possibility of patients infected through blood products not knowing of their infection, would it be important for those patients to be identified and tested and informed?
Well, it would be, but I suspect that even the mild haemophiliacs who, as you say, would probably have little contact with the centre would have been aware in the preceding decade of the existence of a hepatitis C test, and there certainly were great efforts, and we discussed some of these yesterday, in raising awareness of the availability of an HCV test for anybody who had received blood transfusion or blood products.
Just one further document before we break, and this now moves to March 2000. It's SCGV 0000171_052. This is an email from Christine Dora, dated the 28th of March 2000. And I'm looking not at the very top of the page, but that which is, I think, forwarding the email on, but to the next, thank you, to what is now on top of the screen. So it's from Christine Dora to you and to Mrs. Towers. Subject, help, ! Haemophilia and hepatitis C. Now, just to understand, Mrs. Dora or Ms. Dora is the person who was primarily charged with undertaking the investigation, and it's her fact-finding exercise and her conclusions that we see in the investigation report, is it not?
Yes.
And then we see her saying this, Dr. Keel, Mrs. Towers, I've now waded through the papers you got from Prof. Cash relating to SNBTS, and the only things I can say are A, I don't understand half of them, B, as far as I can make out, we in Scotland were only getting around to seriously thinking about ALT testing of donations in March 1988, after the period in question. I suppose we could try to emphasise about how unreliable it was, but that in itself is a big dollop of hindsight. The Haemophilia Society are not going to let it rest if we put nothing in about testing. Can you give me any advice in relation to the sequence of events as they might relate to our investigation? Even something demonstrating that by the time adequate testing of donations was available, heat treatment was already protecting people, or something demonstrating that the testing available at the time was inadequate. Now, again, it may be submitted to the inquiry in due course that this is not a reassuring email to read in terms of the reliability of the conclusions set out in the investigation report, bearing in mind that the lead fact finder is apparently struggling to understand some of the issues. Do you have any observations in relation to that?
Well, first of all, I don't think we know the content of Professor Cash's papers. In my experience of his modus operandi. Many of them possibly didn't relate to the subject of the inquiry. So I don't think it's surprising that Christine Dora, a lay administrator, would not be able to understand medical communications. But what I think we do not know, as I said a minute ago, is what was in those papers from Professor Cash. They may not even have been about hepatitis C. They may have covered other areas. And the other element, of course, is that anything that Christine Dora was going to put in the report relating to the medical facts, then I was there to cross-check them.
Now we can see there being identified a concern arising from Professor Cash's papers about ALT testing and that not having been considered, the inference may be sufficiently timelessly. We see Ms Dora commenting that the Haemophilia Society are not going to rest if we put nothing in about testing. And then if we can just go to the top of the page, there's a handwritten note. I don't think, is that your handwriting? Where it says X is a balance between...
I can't actually be sure. It may be, but I don't think it is.
In any event, it says X, and that's the paragraph about the Haemophilia Society not resting if we put nothing in about testing, is a balance between sticking to what we were asked to do and anticipating further demands. I'm still inclined not to cover testing in the body of the report. Regardless of what the remit of the report was and whether testing fell within the existing remit or not, was the concern about what Scotland had or hadn't done in relation to ALT testing something that was identified and flagged up as an issue for the Minister to consider, as far as you can recall?
I can't recall, and we spent some time on ALT testing yesterday, and I gave you my views on its lack of sensitivity and specificity, in particular in terms of picking up non-A, non-B hepatitis. So I think we probably regarded ALT testing as an irrelevance in the context of trying to understand what efforts were made by SNBTS to produce a non-A, non-B safe product in the mid-1980s.
So I've trespassed into break territory, so perhaps we could take our morning break now.
Yes, well, we'll take a break until 10 to 12. 10 to 12.